Good afternoon. Our guest today is Conservative leadership candidate Charest. Nice to meet you, Mr. Charest.
Thank you very much, Roxalana.
And thanks for coming. So almost 13 million people are believed to have fled their homes in Ukraine since the Russian-Ukrainian war began, according to the United Nations. And more than 6 million have left for neighboring countries, and at least another 6.5 million are thought to be displaced inside the country itself. Refugees also crossing for neighboring countries to the west, mostly Poland, as you know. But some Ukrainians choose Canada for a helping hand, and according to the least available data as of early May, more than 91,000 applications have been already approved. And I have to say that Ukrainian people are really grateful for what a Canadian government is doing right now, but I would like to ask about the most vulnerable categories of Ukrainian refugees and displaced persons who don't have any relatives nor friends here in Canada, and they're coming just with a simple suitcase, right, and no one to pick them up even from the airport. So what's your response to that as a Conservative?
I think Canada should put together a special program for Ukrainians who are coming to this country as displaced persons in most instances, and that we should support those who have no family, have no resources, and allow them to transition into a more normal and stable life. And that means supporting them and helping them find a roof and a place to stay, supporting them financially during that period of transition, or whether it's education or school or healthcare services, and work with the provinces to make that happen. And I'm not at all concerned about the consequences of doing that. We know the Ukrainian people, we know how resourceful they are and how committed they are. They will, if they choose, they will integrate very rapidly. Some may choose to stay here temporarily. We should respect that and allow them to be supported in that period so that they can be secure, and then if they choose, return to their country. So I would really make it a special initiative of the Government of Canada, given the extraordinary consequences of the war in Ukraine.
If you were the Prime Minister today, how would the Canadian government policy regarding war in Ukraine be different?
Well, and it is not a partisan issue, and I don't see it as a partisan issue. None of us should, actually. So when the Government of Canada does something right, we should applaud that and support it. But there are things that I think we should do differently. One of them is that we should offer more lethal weapons to Ukraine, whether it's howitzers or other types, or, for example, light armored vehicles that we make in London, Ontario, and the company General Dynamics makes. We could very well manufacture some of these vehicles and make them available to the army in Ukraine. We could use our procurement to buy equipment elsewhere in the world to make available to the Ukrainian army, who needs to go on the offensive. We also need to make sure that the money that we have already committed gets out the door, that it's actually invested and gets there. And that's not always the case in the bureaucracy of the government. We need to shorten up the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic obstacles to getting people into the country. We've had reports that it has taken a long time in certain instances, and there's delays. We should be preparing a Marshall Plan for the future of Ukraine. We should not wait for the end of the conflict. And we're confident Ukraine will win and will be able to occupy its country and exercise its sovereignty. But there will be a major rebuild of Ukraine, and that's a project for the world. It's not just for the Ukrainian people. Canada should seek a leadership role in organizing that and making sure that countries and the private sector are there to help rebuild Ukraine.
In one of your recent interviews, you've mentioned that the war in Ukraine has brought two main issues. So one is security supply, which no one thinks about unless there is a crisis, and that's definitely the job for the government. And the other issue is that Canada could very well be an alternative to supplying oil and gas to Europe, right? And the cruel situation is that Europeans are indirectly funding Russians' attack to Ukraine. How could Canada make a better choice?
This is a situation that has been brought to light by this conflict and this war in Ukraine. One of them you mentioned, the first one is security of supply. You know, countries don't think about that, and the people in the country don't think about that unless there's a crisis. Well, this crisis has now demonstrated that Canada needs to plan to have access to energy in case there is an emergency. The second one is also very contemporary. Had we had our act together and were able to build pipelines, we could be supplying Europe with the oil and gas they need, as opposed to seeing Europe indirectly fund a war by buying oil and gas from Russia. It is cruel to see that happen, when in fact we could be the alternative, and in offering products that are ethical and products that come from a free country like Canada. So two very important lessons for us. And now we need to take that into account as we build up our resource-based industry in oil and gas. We need to take the lesson and do the right thing in the future and make sure that we can supply energy to Europe.
In light of what's happening in Ukraine right now, one of the big issues is a real wake-up call, I would call it like this, is the sovereignty of the Arctic, because
Yes.
Russia is physically a neighbor of Canada in the north, and Canada has a lot of resources there. And that's going to be one of the biggest issues for this generations of Canadian will be facing. At the same time, 2% of GDP is the NATO recommendation for Canada's national security. And it is going to be a high priority for a new government to be able to simply protect ourselves.
We in Canada need to be much more affirmative about our sovereignty in the North and our defense. For too long, we've relied on the Americans to assume our defense. That's, you know, the reality is that. So we made a commitment to NATO to invest up to 2% of our GDP in defense. We need to respect that and gradually ratchet up our spending. And I say gradually because we just can't spend the money overnight. We're going to have to buy ships and submarines and equipment and invest in having a stronger army. And among the things that I'm proposing in this leadership race is that we open 2 military bases in the Canadian Arctic, one of them with a deep water port. And we are neighbors to Russia. And with climate change, there's 2 commercial routes that are opening in the Arctic. One is the northern route, which Russia controls and is militarized. When they said by the way, they said they would not militarize it, but they have. And then there's the Northwest Passage that is contested. I mean, even our American neighbors and our European friends do not recognize the Northwest Passage as being Canadian territory, when in fact it is. And so it's urgent for us to be in the North and to occupy our sovereignty in our own territory if we want to protect it.
As you know, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and a couple of Canadian ministers, I mean, Chrystia Freeland, Anita Anand, Melanie Joly, have visited Ukraine recently.
Yes.
Any plans for paying a visit to Ukraine in the near future?
I would love to visit Ukraine, and I was part of a government, the government of Canada. I was part of that government that was the first in the world to recognize Ukraine as a country. So I have a special attachment to Ukraine. I would be delighted to visit. Now I'm going to do this leadership race, and I'm not going to assume that I become leader, but if I do become leader of the Conservative Party, and that will be decided early in September, there may be an opportunity to visit, in the right circumstances, of course, given the fact that this war is going on. So I would be, if the right circumstances were there, I would be honored to be able to visit Ukraine and pay my respects to the government, but also the people and the army of Ukraine, who have been an inspiration for all of us.
Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Roxana.